This is Dan, and this is the Napkin Academy. This lesson, as we begin to close out our section on showing, is going to be the first part on applied napkin sketching. So this is part number 1, which is really drawing by hand. I want to talk just for a moment about drawing itself. What I really mean by that is just taking our hand, taking a pen, putting it on a piece of paper, and creating our very simple sketches. We've talked about our tools from our 6x6 to our squid to our Swiss Army knife. Lots of tools about how to be good visual problem solvers. And now what I want to focus on finally at the end for a moment is the drawing itself. And we're going to really break this into two ways of thinking about it. Way number 1 is drawing by hand. And I literally mean in that, drawing without computers. Way number 2, which we'll talk about in our next lesson, is drawing with computers. So the rest of this session, we're going to talk about just drawing by hand. The really big rule, and why I think drawing by hand is so important, is this very simple idea, and it says this: the more human your picture, the more human the response. Now what do I mean by that? Let me give you an example. If I was to show you a drawing that I'd created of an interface for a complex piece of software, and I showed you a drawing like this, where everything is buttoned down and everything looks polished, generated obviously on a computer, a couple of things are going to happen, one of which is you're going to assume that it is done. It looks pretty finished to me. You're going to assume that it is polished, and you're going to assume largely that it is fact, because it looks so complete. Which could be a problem, because if what I'm really interested in is conceptually getting you to recognize that what's important in this interface is the division of the main screen up into 4 components and the addition of a navigation screen over here on the side, those things actually start to fade away as we begin to notice how finished everything looks. So for example, to be able to show a comparison, imagine if I'd showed you the same interface, but it looked like this, where I had drawn it by hand. Now, as you can see, something quite different happens. I can talk you through this drawing and I can say what's important is the fact that I've divided the interface up into my 4 windows, and I have my navigational devices over on the side. And instead of focusing on the details of which typeface I've used, or which data set I've used, or which color I've used, you are focusing on the concept itself, which is really at this level exactly what I want you to focus on. That's what I mean about a hand-drawn picture. There's a certain magic that takes place and a certain lack of judgment, harsh judgment, that we'd often bring when we show a more polished image. I think that there are really 3 reasons for this. Here we have a fairly polished, computer-generated, computer-drawn image of some kind of mechanism. And what's interesting is that when we look at this, I think that we take and we say, we look at it and we say, it looks pretty finished to me. Okay, I will go ahead and I'll do that. I'm not sure I understand it, but I'm going to go ahead and do exactly what that thing shows me or try to figure it out. The option would be, what if I drew something like this? What if I drew essentially the same shape, but said what's really important is the understanding of how these pieces intersect? Isn't it interesting how different this one feels? Number 1, the fact that I drew it before you. Number 2, the fact that it's loose. Number 3, the fact that it's drawn by hand. I think our reaction to this one typically is much more positive if the original idea is, I want you to understand the concept. We say, hey, I get it. Now, the reasons why I think this is true is when we have our hand-drawn picture, the benefit of it, number 1, is that it's clearly not done. Our mechanistically drawn picture, the one that we've polished, looks finished. And if it's done, I'm going to judge it differently. So if I don't want someone to judge the details of my drawing, but the underlying concept, let's show it in a position where it's not done. Point number 2 is because it's not done, it actually remains open to comment. If I had shown you these 2 drawings, this one, and I asked you, do you have any questions? This one's going to take a moment just to figure out what you might ask, And perhaps you're going to think, since it's so polished and finished, there's really nothing meaningful that can be commented on. But when we see it drawn by hand, there's lots of room to say, wait a minute, there's something over here I don't understand. What about this part over here? Or what about this part over here? And I think the third reason why it's so important to get this human reaction by drawing our picture in human is that it really does show that we believe our own audience is smart. And what I mean by that is I don't need to give you every single detail to understand what my concept is. I am going to assume that you are smart enough to be able to make sense of this drawing that I make in front of you and recognize that what I'm trying to show you is the idea. And if you can see my idea, we are going to have a much more interesting dialogue between you and me than if the idea is actually obscured behind the polish. So for now, for the rest of this lesson and for almost all of the drawing that I want you to do, we're going to say, let's not use the computers and let's not even draw on the iPad, because what we really, really want to focus on is this incredible interaction that takes place between what we're thinking and what we are able to draw. The act of putting pen to paper and moving it around is a really clear connection, a direct connection between what's in our mind's eye and the most pure expression we can make of it visually. So nothing wrong with computers, but for the time being, we're not going to use them. But I don't want you to worry. We're not the only people who are going to take this paper and pen route towards clarifying good ideas. Let me show you what I mean. You all know that I'm a big fan of Leonardo da Vinci, who of course drew everything by hand. You know, there was Charles Darwin, smart fella himself, who drew in his notebooks by hand because he wanted to get the ideas down as quickly as he could. There was this other crazy man, guy named Dmitri Mendeleev, who liked to draw as well. He liked to draw complex charts and graphs, and one of his drawings became the periodic table of the elements. This is Alexander Graham Bell, who used to draw by hand all the time, who believed it was impossible to actually understand an idea until you were able to draw it out by hand. Not too different than Thomas Edison, the inventor of the light bulb. And here, of course, are the drawings that Thomas Edison made by hand as he was exploring the options of how to create his light bulb. Albert Einstein drew everything. He loved to be able to draw by hand. One of the greatest drawings he ever did has nothing to do with the theory of relativity. It has to do with his feet. And he wanted his foot to sit in a shoe like that, but instead it was all bunched up like this. J.R.R. Tolkien, famous author, Lord of the Rings, was unable to write his books unless he could draw the maps by hand that explained where his action was taking place. Another author who liked to draw things out by hand, Jack Kerouac. This is actually the model for his very first novel. This is a fellow. You've probably not heard of the name, but you certainly know what he did. Alec Isigenes was, by drawing by hand on the back of a napkin, the inventor of the original Mini. This is a woman named Donella Meadows, who used to draw by hand all the time, and in her drawing invented something called systems thinking, and has gone on to become one of the most influential ways of modeling out complex systems ever, drawn by hand. This, of course, famous guy, we've talked about him before. Here he is, Mr. Rollin King, the man who drew the original Southwest Airlines business plan on a napkin, drawn, of course, by hand. Arit Gadyesh, who was the chairman of Bain & Company, one of the largest consulting companies on earth, who drew initially the logo for her company by hand, trying to explain that she wanted people to understand how a compass works, that you need to focus on true north. Here's another author, J.K. Rowling, who, of course we know, in writing all of her Harry Potter books, would rely on drawing things out on blocks of paper by hand in order to make sure that her ideas were being clear and in order to understand how she was going to pull all the pieces together. One of the more famous ones of all time, I've just finished reading the Steve Jobs biography by Walter Isaacson, What's fascinating is every time Steve Jobs, not the nicest man who ever lived, but certainly a man who knew what he wanted to do, when he wanted to convince other people that he was right, what would he do? Turns out that Steve Jobs was the absolute master of the whiteboard. He recognized that if you went to the whiteboard and started drawing by hand, you could absolutely control not only the meeting, but you could get everybody to see exactly what it was that you were thinking about. And a real recent one, in fact, this just came up in Fortune magazine this week. Very interesting, nice sketch drawn by a guy named Mark Benioff, who happens to be the CEO of Salesforce.com, one of the more forward-looking software companies, who sat down with a woman named Angela Arendts, who is the CEO of a company called Burberry out of London, which you might know as a lifestyle brand. And the two sat down to think about what's the future of the Burberry company. Mark Benioff created this sketch to say how the company might become a social media driven company, and made a friend and business partner probably for life from the fact that he drew by hand. I know that I'm going on, but the reason why this is important is because if you think about how smart these people were and how critical it was that they get their idea across, you'll notice that what mattered was the fact that they drew it by hand. There's three ways that we can draw by hand. There are three tools that we can use. The first one is I call the personal tools. What I mean is when we have an idea in mind and we want to work through that idea with someone else, we take the simplest type of drawing material that we can, just a piece of paper and a pen, or, a notebook and a pen. It could be our little personal whiteboard with our pen. But this is the personal tool where we are working through our own idea and we draw it out and we say, is this what I meant? Do you get it? What do you think? And then I might say, here, can I have the pen because I think we need to add this piece over here. This is what I call the personal hand-drawn drawing space. Piece of paper, notebook, little whiteboard. Level 2 is what I'm going to call the participatory drawing surface. This is where we have a group of people coming together and we want to develop an idea together. It's a little bit less personal, it's a little bit more about the participation of people. And in this case, the tool that we're going to use, of course, is a big whiteboard. Or in the old days, of course, that would have been a chalkboard. Or, sometimes we still even use a flip chart. But the point is we want to get a big enough drawing surface to where I can start drawing my idea over here. You can be drawing your part over here. We can then have participation from other people as we see the drawing emerge and begin to understand what the likely outcome or solution is going to be. So this is a little bit more active. And then, of course, the third type of drawing surface is what I call the performance drawing surface. And this is the one every time we're making a presentation, every time we're trying to make a sale, every time we're trying to teach. When it's from me outwards to somebody else, we want to have a performance drawing surface. And the issue is here, it's challenging. We can't use a little piece of paper anymore because these people can't see it. Nor can we even use a typical size whiteboard because these people won't be able to see it. So we need to come up with something else, some other way of being able to draw so that a large audience can see it live. Now, this is what we're going to talk about primarily in the next lesson, but I'll give you a little preview of coming attractions. What we're going to be talking about only at this level is, yes, the addition of the computer, so that we will be able to draw something on the screen and have it appear simultaneously where everybody can see it. And it's exactly what I'm doing right now as I'm drawing for you, and we're going to talk about this in our next lesson where we get into digital. But the point I want to make is I am still drawing by hand. It's just that the surface I'm using happens to be a performance-based surface, which is digital. But the thing I want to emphasize is I'm still making the simple hand-drawn picture. Now, one way to think about these three different surfaces is how much we would want to prepare when we're working on our different drawings. What I mean by that is if we're going to be working on really the personal drawing, This is something which is largely spontaneous. It takes no preparation. It just takes the two of us saying, we've got an idea, let's start drawing it out. Now, if we make a spectrum from the most spontaneous moving over to the most fully rehearsed, about halfway across it is what we would have as our participatory drawing surface. Now, if you're going to go the route of drawing on a big whiteboard, I recommend that we be partially prepared. That is, if we are the owner of this particular meeting, that what we want to do is we want to come prepared enough to say the 3 or 4 essential things that we want to explore together are these. We want to set up just the basics to be partially prepared, so then we can kind of unleash the creative power that comes through group drawing. If we are not prepared at all, we're very likely to get into some kind of chaos, not because there's anything wrong with drawing, but because it's very hard when there are so many different people involved if there isn't some underlying structure that we've agreed to start. And then, of course, our performance drawing side. Performance drawing is where we want to be fully rehearsed. If we're going to go out in front of a cast of people and say, this is really the idea, and I really want you to believe in it, and this is a true performance, we are going to be fully rehearsed. This is where things get interesting, because even though we're still going to draw by hand, we will have practiced and practiced and practiced so that we are totally confident in what we can do. And as we draw out our simple picture in front of this audience, they are going to see the magic of instant visual comprehension. Let's review this little spectrum really quickly. Here's the point I want to make. If you are wishing to simply explore your idea, be spontaneous, grab a piece of paper and a pen, and just go. If you want to work through the idea collectively, go ahead and partially prepare. Start with something that's ready to go, and then go ahead and bring your team together. If, however, we want to sell our idea, we better be pretty buttoned up. We want to be fully rehearsed, even though we're going to look spontaneous. The fact is, we actually know exactly what it is that we're talking about. How do we get good at doing all of these drawings? I've given you lots of tools over these last lessons, but in the end, it's very, very simple. Practice, practice, practice. I want us to be drawing simple pictures all the time. You'll notice as you've gone through these lessons that there's rarely a moment that I don't have something, whatever it might be, appearing on the screen while I am talking. This comes from practice, and the practice specifically is a few years ago I came up with a little mantra because I knew the power of pictures, but I also knew how easy it was to fall into our standard of just talking things through and forgetting to draw the pictures. So I took my mantra, I wrote it on this post-it note, and it has remained above my desk for the last 6 years. And what the post-it note says is, you can read it yourself. Dan, whenever I can draw something, I will draw something. Doesn't matter what the idea is. If I'm trying to explain how we're going to get from our home to the restaurant, and I need to try to give directions to someone, if I could draw it out, I will draw it out. Why would I just talk if I could draw it? If we're talking about where we want to go on vacation, why not go ahead and say we live here, but where we want to go is we want to go down here to Florida? Why not go ahead and draw it out? That is the rule for how to get practice. Every time you can draw something, draw it. And it is with that practice that you will find that even if you're a terrible drawer, you're going to become very good, and you're going to become, above all, very confident in your drawing. And that's when the real magic is going to start. All right. So it's time for a little bit of transition now that I really do want us to learn to be very comfortable with drawing out our ideas with our quick stick figures, our simple shapes. We've talked about them all. Our practice, being able to make our maps, being able to make our charts, being able to create our timelines, to visually record almost instantly what it is that we're thinking. Take that pencil, draw it out very fast. But the transition becomes the following. we do live in the age of the digital, and it is miraculous what we can now start to do when we combine our ability to draw by hand with the best capabilities of our computers and software. And so that's when I talk about the transition now. We're going to start to move into the next lesson, and I want to talk a little bit about how we draw by hand. How we draw by hand and use technology in the best possible way. Yeah, let's go ahead and bring out our iPad or our tablet. Here's how we do it. I so strongly believe in drawing things by hand that even my children do this. So we were making a checklist recently before we went on our winter camping trip, and I asked my young daughter if she wouldn't go ahead and make the checklist to make sure that we had all our clothes. And so she drew on her little whiteboard this lovely picture. Well, now here's the thing. How do I digitize that picture so that I could maybe share it with the friends that we were going to be traveling with so that they were able to look at the same checklist? How would I do this? Because obviously my daughter just drew it on a whiteboard. What, am I going to mail the whiteboard to someone? No, but it's very simple. We all know how to do it. Of course we do. We draw our picture, and every one of us now has a miraculous scanner built in to our phone. So we take our iPhone and we just take a picture of what we drew. And to be fair, it may also be, of course, an Android phone, and we can take a picture. It may even be a Windows phone. The point is, after we've drawn our picture, we have the ability to digitize it and share it electronically without ever interfering with our ability to draw by hand, because we just take a photo of it. And then once we've taken the photo, we simply email it out. And now everybody's got a lovely digital copy of what we drew by hand. But wait a minute, there's a problem, isn't there? Because the fact is, most of us know that if we take a photo with one of our cameras and we take a photo of a drawing we did, it ends up looking terrible. It looks really bad. This is in fact the unadulterated picture that came from my taking a photo of my daughter's whiteboard drawing. And that's not a very dynamic photo. So here's what we're going to do. I want all of us, this is my favorite little app for my iPhone, JotNot Scanner Pro. What it does is it's a little app that takes the photo for us through our phone and automatically turns the image that we drew into a beautiful, high contrast, high color, digital version of our drawing instantly. And this looks beautiful, doesn't it? If I go back for a moment, we know how terrible it is when you draw something on a whiteboard or a piece of paper and you take a photo of it. Use JotNot and look how beautifully it comes out. I can now take this image, paste it into a PowerPoint or Keynote document or into my Google Doc, and it looks like it was drawn right on the computer, but the fact is I still retain the ability to draw it by hand, and now I've turned it into a digital file in seconds for distribution and sharing around the world. Isn't that something? So I want to close out this part on part 1 of drawing by hand with 2 thoughts. Thought number 1 is, remember, the more human our picture, the more human will be our response. That is to say, if I draw something and you can see that I really meant it and I'm thinking aloud, you will be very pleased to have even seen me work on it. The second is that there is a transition that we can go through from hand-drawn to digital to take advantage of the best aspects of technology without having to force ourselves to draw through a mouse or using a keyboard, which is going to kill much of our creativity. And it's this transition from hand-drawn to digital that we're going to focus on in part